I think when we talk about diversity issues, we have to talk about power relationships and social constructions and how things get to be the way that they are in order to understand how to move forward and change them. And so for me, history is a big part of that. Okay, it helps to inform the present. The past very much does. So when I was thinking about this, I was thinking about, survivorship. We had a speaker at the university a couple of weeks ago, Attica Locke, who's an author, and she came to my African American history class, and we were talking about plantation slavery and how she likes to look at it in terms of survivorship, and I thought that was really important. But if I were to come here and talk about that and talk about all the other political and social structures that go with diversity, frankly, we'd be here for many semesters, and we don't have that kind of time. So the way that I conceived of this talk today is to pick certain moments, okay? So a handful of snapshots of some historical significance on a local level, because oftentimes when you study history, if you're taking a survey, you're getting a lot of big picture, right? If you're taking more particular stuff, you get a lot of New York maybe, right? A lot of Boston perhaps. We don't get a lot of local Connecticut history. At least I don't talk about it a lot in my job. So today we're going to be doing that. We're going to look at a handful of different ethnic and social histories and thinking about the ways in which they might inform our understanding of who we are as Connecticutans, not beggars, right? Who we are as nutmeggers and where we'd like to think that we will go. So I'm just going to click through the slides here. This is UNCAS, and I'm sure you're all vaguely familiar with UNCAS. At minimum, maybe you've seen Hollywood UNCAS, right? Maybe you've seen The Last of the Mohicans, which is a real misunderstanding of a lot of historical fact. It's an interesting novel, but it's problematic. And if you've ever been to Mohegan Sun, right, if you've been down towards Mystic, Connecticut, you've seen UNCAS-related stuff. This is a 19th century depiction of UNCAS, and if you know your 19th century imagery at all, a lot of it looks like this. It's very dramatic, kind of over the top, and of course he's got the full headdress because why wouldn't he? It's the 19th century. And then on the far side, that is a monument to UNCAS, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. That's in Norwich, Connecticut. In reality, he's born in 1598, and he's born a little before the invasion, if you want to look at it that way, or the colonization, if you want to look at it that way, or the grand discovery, if you want to look at it that way, of America, okay? And by the time that he was an adult, this change is fully underway, all right? His people have begun to die from European diseases. Smallpox is the big one, and they're beginning to be sort of torn apart by the tensions of just having to deal with the English. Because the English put Native Americans all over America in a very tough position. And we'll talk about that in a moment. Now he's a Mohegan, and Mohegan incidentally means wolf people. But in the early 1600s, the Mohegan were sort of subsumed under the Pequot tribe. The Pequot was a bigger group. They were more or less balanced within the group together, but they were very powerful, and they were centered around Mystic, Connecticut, and he helps to cement that association because he marries the daughter of the sachem of the Pequots, but she dies. Okay, so when she dies, that puts your whole alliance sort of out of whack, and it puts him in a tough position in terms of what he wants for himself and for his people. And shortly thereafter, the balance inside this tribe began to shift. It began to favor the Pequot more, and this ticked him off. He also didn't like the new sachem who took over after his father-in-law died. This is a guy named Sassacus. And he has the support of Native Americans out of Rhode Island. These guys are called Narragansetts. You've probably seen their name on beer, which is kind of sad. But he has their support, and he decides to launch a rebellion, but it doesn't go very well, and he kind of comes home tail between his legs, and he has to do this whole ceremonial, ritual humiliation procedure, which is kind of rough for him, and he sort of bides his time for a little while. And by the mid-1630s, he takes off again, and he takes some followers with him, and he sets up an independent Mohegan tribe. And that's really interesting. It's all well and good. But 1638 is kind of a rough time to start setting out on your own, because at that point, the English settlers, and we'll call them settlers just to pick a word for lack of a better one, The English settlers have largely moved into the Connecticut River Valley, and they're heading further down the state, or what we think of as the state. Of course, they didn't think of it that way. And he has to make a decision that countless chiefs had to make in the 17th century. Do you ally with the English, or don't you? If he allies with them, or doesn't, well, that decision's fraught with peril, isn't it? The Puritans, who formed the bulk of the settlers in this area, these folks believe that if the land is not being used properly, and I've got big air quotes for that because properly is a really relative, subjective term, right? I might think that you're not wearing your hair properly, but maybe you love to wear it that way, and who am I to say? Well, for them, if the land wasn't being used properly, which meant clear cut and planted, right? If you picture like an English field, that's what they imagine, then God thinks it's bad, and you can take it. And when they look at how the Native Americans farm, which is not in the English style, they see that as a chance to take it. And so they do. So if you're UNCAS, and you make the decision to fight against them, it's kind of a suicide mission in many cases. But it's a way of preserving your sovereignty, your independence. If you don't, well, they're just going to take your land anyway in some cases. What choice do you have to make? It's a really tough decision. So there's also the chance that your decision could backfire, and of course that happens periodically in American history. UNCAS makes the decision to ally with the English. He makes the decision to ally with the English, and we can look at this in two different ways. One is that he's shrewd, right? He's a smart guy. He knows that the indigenous peoples, that they are not going to be able to stand up against the weaponry and the sheer might of the English as these things go on. He knows that they might be useful in crushing the people he doesn't like. Okay, so he helps to crush the Pequot ultimately. For a very long time in New England, there were next to no Pequots. Now there's a handful, right? They're down by Foxwoods, that part of Connecticut. For a long time, there really weren't any. There's a terrible war, the Pequot War in 1637. It starts with a massacre of women and children, Pequot women and children. It's a bloody, awful thing. He helps to make that happen, but while he does so, his people survive. Right? His people survive, and they survive that war. They also survive a war that comes some 40 years later that he helps to fight in King Philip's War. And King Philip's War is a terrible war. That rages up and down what we think of as the New England sort of eastern seaboard. Simsbury is destroyed in King Philip's War, part of Simsbury. He preserves them from that. So that's a good thing. They do compel him to sign a treaty. He signs a treaty in the 1630s that agrees that he and the Mohegans are just an extension of the colony and can only operate if the English say it's okay. And that's a tricky thing. But they're not dead. And that's a significant thing. So it's sort of a tough call. Does he forfeit Native American sovereignty for his own independence? It's a tough call. Now, what makes it really tricky, I think, for me and for other historians to conceptualize, is this monument. Because the cornerstone for this monument was laid by President Jackson. What do you know about President Jackson? Trail of Tears, right? Trail of Tears is this murderous, terrible thing that President Jackson and the later President Van Buren helped to engineer, where they forcibly moved Cherokee Indians out of Georgia, what they call, it's the cotton growing deep south, parts of the cotton growing deep south. They're moved forcibly to Oklahoma in the winter. And out of some 13,000 that start the trip, I can't remember the number, is it 4,000 survive? Some really terrible odds. And so what does it say when that guy memorializes this guy? Right? What is he memorializing? If Jackson likes this fellow, then that might say something less than appealing about UNCAS. But that changes over time, right? So whereas he might have seen UNCAS as someone, he's clearly celebrating him because he helped English people kill other Native Americans. That's really what that boils down to in many ways. At the same time, we might look at that differently. And it's that tension, I think, that we still live with. Okay, that tension that we still live with. Whether it's when we're going by these sorts of memorials and we don't think twice about them, or when we contemplate the positions of Native Americans in our current society. There aren't terribly many of them. The 2010 census, in case you're curious, The Connecticut population that identified as Native American alone was 0.31%. There's a pretty tiny number. It's 11,000 people, give or take a couple. So these things are all at attention when we consider a guy like Uncas. But anyway, that's just one snapshot. Let's talk about another. This is Fortune. Maybe you saw Fortune recently. He was all over the news 3 or 4 weeks ago. This is about a century and a half after Uncas. And Fortune was, there's an artist's rendition of him over on the side. Fortune was a slave here in Connecticut in the 1700s, in the late 1700s. And Connecticut was an agricultural place in those days. It was rolling farmlands, hills, and very prosperous farmers. Many of these guys who are prosperous farmers are also doctors and lawyers and that kind of thing. They tend to be the colonial elite, okay, so they're politicians as well. And the backbone of that system, especially if you want to be both a prosperous farmer and you want to be a lawyer or what have you, was slavery in those days, okay? And many Northerners, I think, we tend to forget that slavery existed here. When we think about slavery, we think about the South, and we think about the Civil War as a war in which the South was vanquished and slavery was vanquished by self-righteous Northerners. And the reality of that is a whole heck of a lot more complicated. And the North indeed had a fair number of slaves. Now compared to the South, they've got far fewer. Okay, that's true. There are far fewer slaves in New England than you see, say, in Virginia. But Connecticut had quite a few. Connecticut had one of the most dense New England slave populations. And Connecticut was the last New England state to abolish slavery, which is interesting. And it's actually far more interesting than I thought it was going to be, not in a good way. We'll talk about that in just a second. Fortune's one of these slaves. And since he was in the news recently, I thought we would talk about him. A lot of our African Americans who live in Connecticut now, their roots indeed go back to men like Fortune, men and women who were enslaved here. A number of them also have roots that go further back to the South. There's a wave of African American migration in the 20th century that's known as the Great Migration, but we don't have time to talk about that today. Now, incidentally, the first Connecticut slaves were Pequots. After that Pequot War in the 1630s, the remaining Pequot, a number of them are enslaved. Some of them are sold by Connecticut merchants to the West Indies. And in the West Indies, you have sugar slavery, which is a particularly brutal form of labor. But the Pequot indeed were compelled to serve as slaves here in Connecticut. They are part of that triangle trade that I'm sure you've heard of sugar, rum, and slaves. By 1690, in Connecticut, rules governing slave behavior began being known as slave codes, and they basically list very particular regulations for how slaves and white people will interact and operate inside the colony. And by the 18th century, and I thought this was really striking, so by the 1700s, Connecticut made slaveholders financially responsible for any slaves they liberated. And what that does is it limits how many people are going to free their slaves. Right? It's a way of essentially maintaining a system in place, a slave system in place. Now you see this across the South periodically as well. It's in, I think, the 1710 Virginia slave laws. It limits manumission. It maintains slavery. By the mid-1700s, there are some 1,000 slaves in the Connecticut colony. Incidentally, in case you're wondering, Native Americans have dwindled to 500 people. And the number of African Americans in the colony is revised to 3,500 by I think it's 1756. Now, we've got no way of knowing among these African Americans how many of them are enslaved and how many are free. The census, or it's not even a census, it's a local survey. They don't specify the distinction between those things. Now, with the Revolution, a number of states, colonies turned states, begin to enact different kinds of manumission laws, freeing laws, right, emancipation laws. And New England is in the forefront of passing those. It only makes sense with the rhetoric of the revolution that they're going to pass some of these kinds of laws. Vermont, and this really shouldn't surprise you, Vermont tends to be at the forefront of a lot of these sort of social changes. Vermont's the first one. I think it's 1770 when Vermont frees all of their slaves. I can't imagine there were very many, but those who were there, they free. Rhode Island, I believe, is next, and New Hampshire. And then a number of states, Connecticut included, passed what are called gradual emancipation laws. And what a gradual emancipation law is a law that specifies a time. And any slave, usually it's slaves who are, any people rather, who are born after that time to slave parents or slave mothers usually, those folks will be free. Any folks born to those same parents 6 months earlier will be enslaved. And it's supposed to work as a gradual phasing out of the institution of slavery. But what it oftentimes does is it prolongs the institution of slavery for a very long time. And Connecticut, they passed that law in 1784, and it's a really sort of sneaky piece of legislation because it liberates any babies that are born, I think it's after 1784 will be free when they turn 25. So it's a way of emancipating people sort of later, eventually, maybe. Right? It's not a very decisive piece of legislation in that regard. It's clearly there to say, well, we're doing something about this, but we're really not going to do it very quickly. They eventually changed it, I didn't write down what year, to 21, which is only marginally better. They abolished slavery, and I found this to be, I had no idea it was the slaves, 1848. That's sort of remarkable. I mean, you're 12, 13 years outside the Civil War at that point. 1848. Now, there aren't many slaves left in Connecticut. There are 17. But those 17 folks had to serve until the late 1840s. I find that really stunning in a place that's very much lit up with abolitionism and people who are interested in getting rid of slavery altogether. At any rate. Fortune here, he was likely born in the 1740s, and we don't know where. Right? He might have been born in Africa because the transatlantic slave trade was alive and well in those days. He might have been born in the West Indies, what we think of as the Caribbean. Okay? He may have been part of that, again, that triangle trade and shipped northward. He might have been born here in Connecticut, for all we know. That there is no record tells us something about how little colonists valued that information. Right? They didn't care, so they didn't write it down. And so we have no way of knowing. He lived in Waterbury, Connecticut with his family. He had a wife, Dinah. He had several children. And they were the slaves of Dr. Preserved Porter. I didn't know anybody named their children Preserved, but there you go. They're listed in the 1790 census because Connecticut recorded all births regardless of who was born, whose status they had. We know that in the 1780s, we know that the whole family was here in the 1780s because his kids are born after that 1784 deadline. So a number of his kids will be free when they turn 25. He's got one son, his eldest son, who was born sometime in the 1870s. His name is Africa, which I find really telling. His son Africa would never be freed by the Connecticut gradual emancipation law. So you can see this whole family being torn apart by this political process. Now, Dr. Porter was a doctor, right? So he's got a thriving medical practice, but he's also got this large farm that does very well. And so that tells us that in all likelihood, that's where we'll find Fortune and his family. They are working on that farm. They're allowed to stay together, which in many parts of the colonies is a rare enough thing. They have their own home, and I'm not just talking that they've been provided a shack, which is much more common. They're listed in the census as owning a house a quarter-mile from the property. And that's fairly unusual in most areas that have a number of slaves. Dr. Porter dies some 6 years later, and then a lot of the sort of nice particulars, as nice as these things get, changed. His kids and his wife are willed to different families, different arms of the family. His daughter gets some, I think his son gets some, his wife. So the family begins to split up. Now geographically they're probably not going very far, but still, that's just the way that it is. Now, Fortune joins the local Episcopal Church in 1797, which doesn't seem like necessarily a huge piece of information, but it actually is for the story. And he dies the next year. Now, it's an interesting snapshot all on its own, but here's the thing. When Fortune died, Dr. Porter is still alive. He takes the body and he uses it as a cadaver for his studies. In those days, medical textbooks were pretty rare. Cadavers were kind of hard to come by. They don't get a lot of volunteers. So you take the bodies that can't say no. And slaves happen to be high among that number. So he takes Fortune's body. Fortune likely died of some kind of fall. The story was that he fell into, I can't remember, a lake or a river, and he cracks a vertebra in his neck, and that does him in. After he's done with the cadaver, he strips the skeleton, and he keeps that in his practice, and his son's practice, and in the family for generations. And that's a really disturbing story. Now, we don't know if he asked Dinah, Fortune's wife, her permission. We don't know if he asked the children. We don't know if, even if he had, because of the way that power is constructed, if those people, the wife and the kids, would have felt like they could say no, or if they did say no, if anybody would listen to them. We don't know how exactly this happened, but it does. Several generations of Porter children recalled using the bones for toys, and that they all learned basic anatomy because the bones were labeled, and they all knew it was Fortune's body, and they would learn their anatomy that way. I don't know about you, I find this really disturbing. They're donated to a museum in Waterbury in the 1930s by yet another Porter descendant, yet another doctor, Dr. Sally Porter, and they displayed it there. They strung it together and hung it up for 30 odd years until the civil rights movement happened, and they thought that was not a really good idea anymore, and they boxed it up and they shelved it, and it sat there for what, 50 years? 45, 50 years. And the bones would only come out for scholars at that point. So on occasion you might get an anthropologist, a historian, a biologist who would take these things out and use them. And on the one hand, there are details about Connecticut slavery that we can learn from Fortune's body that we might not have learned otherwise. And I had no idea you could do this stuff until I started reading about this a few weeks ago, but evidently your teeth can give indications if you run a DNA study of where you're from. And I don't know, I assume there's something sciencey that explains that. I'm not entirely sure what that is. And your bones, of course, can indicate what kind of injuries you've sustained. And we know that Fortune, at some point in his adult life, had broken his back, but that it was well healed. And we don't know what that means, right? Did he have a natural fall? But because he was a slave of a doctor, he was patched up well. Or was it violence? When you read, for example, runaway slave advertisements from the 18th century, a lot of them will talk about injuries that the slaves carry with them. And that's oftentimes indicative of violence they have sustained wherever they are from. The only things that we really know for sure is that he was in generally good health when he died. He was about 60 years old.
Did they ever bury the bones?
That's where I'm going. Many others have argued, and they won recently, that using Fortune's bones in this way only reasserted his position as property, which is what he had been during his living life. And St. John's Episcopal Church, which was the church, well, sort of like the descendant of the church that he had joined in 1797, they claimed him as one of their parishioners, and they buried him just a few weeks ago. Just a few weeks ago in Waterbury. In September, he was buried. And that's what you see down here. He was in the state capitol in the rotunda. He lay in state for a couple of days there. And this story, it's striking and disturbing in a lot of different ways, but it's not unlike a lot of other stories, which is actually what makes it more disturbing. Maybe you're familiar with the story of Henrietta Lacks. Henrietta Lacks was a woman who went in to have a tumor removed. She passes away. The cells from her tumor are used in scientific research across the country for decades. And her family had no idea. They never told them, never asked their permission. And that's a pretty nasty violation of one's human rights to have that happen. And arguably, of course, that's the same thing with Fortune here and now. But they're only considered violations of human rights from our perspective, right? From a perspective that's relatively young. In Fortune's day, that wouldn't have seemed weird at all to take his body and use it for science. To us, that seems like a violation of his space. And so that tells us something about how concepts of race and diversity and the tension of these things, how they change over time. But I thought I would share that with you because it was all over the front of the current just not that long ago when he was finally put to rest. Now, our third figure is Young Wing. Young Wing was born in 1828 in Macau. This is a city in China that had been colonized by Portugal some centuries before. He grew up poor, but he had an instructor at school, eventually in Hong Kong, that took a great interest in him and brought him to Hartford, Connecticut. And he became a student eventually at Yale. And in 1852, he took American citizenship. He became the first Chinese student to graduate from an American university, and he was among some very few Chinese people in this state. So he's a high-status figure in the 19th century. And he lobbied very hard for China to establish a mission school in Connecticut to facilitate the arrival of other students like himself, long-term educational visits by young Chinese men. And it takes them 20 years to put this together, to get China on board with it, and eventually they do open it. You can see some of the building right there. It's this great big sort of Elizabethan style, huge building. He had 120 students, and students who came and partook in this, they stayed oftentimes with some of Harvard's best families. Right, there was that whole sort of culture, status-based, or rather class-based culture. They would stay with some of these very wealthy folks. They would oftentimes end up in American universities. They had to serve at least some of their time at West Point and perform some military service. They could also go to Annapolis. And the idea for this was to give the young Chinese visitors opportunities that they could then take back to China. In particular, they wanted these kids to learn a lot of technology-based skills, and they would take that information back to China. So they were going to gain some things from the West, but still retain a distinctly Chinese sense of self. Now, Young himself, he's an interesting guy. He returns to the States off and on. He marries the daughter of a prominent Avon family. Her dad was a minister. And they have a couple of kids, and they set up a house down in Avon. And that alone is really unusual in 19th century America. Because by the time, this is right around the 1870s, the mid-1870s, by that point, in most of America, the Chinese are viewed carefully would be an understatement, with great hostility is a much better way to put it. In California, for example, and up and down the West Coast, where they're involved in building the railroads, they are oftentimes attacked, berated, persecuted, violence is committed upon them. It's pretty terrible for a number of Chinese people who have migrated to America. And his experience is entirely different from that. Entirely different from that. He never mentions any persecution or harassment that he experienced. He writes a book called My Life in China and America. He writes this in 1909. He says that his wife's family were welcoming and magnanimous, especially as things, they get very complicated very quickly for him. One of his descendants noted that their wedding rocked Hartford, but she didn't say what that meant. So we don't know if it was more like a gossipy scandal kind of thing, like we believe it, or if it became something a little more hostile. We don't really know. Now, it could be that Connecticut members had joined the sort of national chorus of hatred for the Chinese. That's possible. You see that in New York in particular, in San Francisco, or if it's just, people tittering behind their backs, which may be the more likely outcome. So at any rate, he founds this school. It's 1872, he's got 120 students. The kids live with some of the elite families of the area. Supposedly they went to all these parties and balls and they danced with Mark Twain's daughters. I mean, it must have been quite something. And their experience as Chinese in America is unlike the experience of the vast majority of Chinese people in America. It's high. It's facilitated by class. Whereas most Chinese in America are working class and they're getting paid below what white people are getting paid, which means that the white people tend to get very angry about this and riot. These guys, their Chineseness is almost hidden by the fact that they are with wealthy people. They are welcomed because they are with wealthy people. Now, they're exoticized, absolutely. Right? They are seen as this unusual other. You've got to invite them to your parties because, well, there they are, right? That's how they're oftentimes looked at in the 19th century. Folks who are non-white are exoticized. But they seem to have sort of adjusted to that just fine. They form a baseball team. They call it the Orientals. And they nickname it the Celestials. Now, I'm really uncomfortable with the word Orientals, but they were less so because of the time. Celestials it's a very tongue-in-cheek nickname for their team. The word celestial was oftentimes a derogatory epithet for people who were Confucianists? I don't remember the words for that. But anyway, people who followed Confucianism. They would be nicknamed celestials as though they were sun worshippers. And so they call themselves that. It's sort of firmly tongue-in-cheek. And at one point, when they're leaving, and we'll talk about why they leave, they play a team and they win in Oakland, California, which is kind of a remarkable thing because Oakland is a hotbed for anti-Chinese sentiment. And so it's a big deal that they win this game. But at any rate, their experiences point to the fluidity of Chinese experience here in America. Right? Just in the same way that different Native Americans experience invasion, colonization differently, in the same way that African Americans experience slavery and survival differently, these folks reflect the fluidity of Chinese experiences here as well. Now things get really ugly though, fairly fast. A number of these guys, they cut off their queues, that long braid that was traditional in Chinese cultures for a very long time. It was mandatory for most young men in those days. They cut them off, and the Chinese government that had sponsored them is not happy at all, because to them this is a sign of their westernization. And then, when they go to do this is in the 1880s, when they go to serve their time at West Point, they're barred entry. This had been an arrangement for a long time between the Chinese government and the American government. They're forbidden to actually go and spend the time that they're supposed to spend there. And the reason for this is because of the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. And the Chinese Exclusion Act was this piece of national policy that was really, it came out of California. Okay? Angry people in California, angry white people in California had petitioned for this thing. It is a piece of legislation. It's the first what we think of as anti-immigrant legislation or immigration legislation, where it prohibited a group altogether from coming in. So the act says no more, we're going to forbid any more Chinese from coming in, and all Chinese people cannot ever be naturalized. They cannot become citizens. They cannot partake in a political process. And so this combination of the kids cutting off their queues, becoming more westernized, the rejection from West Point, and this nasty piece of legislation, well, the two governments just call it off. The Chinese mission folds in 1882. Young and his students are all called back to China. The stress on Mrs. Young, who was prior to Mrs. Kellogg, she's already sick. She dies from the stress of him coming and going and not being allowed back in the country. She passes away shortly thereafter. Within, I think, 10 years, there's a coup in China, and Young finds himself on the outs with the government, and there's a bounty on his head. But he can't stay there, and he can't come here. And he's in this terrible sort of in-between place. He petitions for a return to America. He says, look, I'm an American citizen. And the government says, yeah, about that, we changed our mind. We're revoking it because you're Chinese. So even though he had been this sort of luminary figure not that long before, his citizenship of 30 years is revoked. He wants to come back to the States in particular to see his sons, who he hasn't seen. They're Americans. They were born here. One of them is about to graduate from Yale, so he smuggles himself into the country, watches the one son graduate, writes his book, and dies impoverished in Hartford in 1912. So it ends in a really sad sort of place. And ultimately, the real tragedy here is that Young's fluid experience is just like the norm for many Chinese people in this country at that point. His experience of being not treated differently because he was Chinese, or not treated poorly because he was Chinese, ends up being subject to that law change. And indeed, like so many other folks, he is left to die alone, essentially, in poverty, which is reinforced by the social systems we have. Now, what quarter of something you have? Okay. We're going to have one last figure that we're going to talk about to shoot forward just a little more. This is Maria Colón Sánchez. And Maria Sánchez was born in Puerto Rico. And she's a politician here in Hartford. And she's the first Hispanic woman to serve in the state's General Assembly. And you can see her down there. It's a good picture of her, but you can also see her leaning against the wall up there. Now, Sánchez is also a migrant. She leaves home when she's 28 years old. She sets out for Hartford because there was a growing Puerto Rican settlement, a group of folks who had settled in the last 30-odd years. And you see that across many eastern seaboard cities in the 20th century. New York, Boston, I think even Baltimore. A lot of these urban areas have fairly growing, dense populations of Puerto Rican folks who had migrated from the island across the middle of the 20th century. She works in the state's tobacco fields and at other places, and the money that she makes, she largely sends home to her family. And before long, she became highly involved in the movement of Puerto Ricans for greater respect of their rights and for their concerns at both the state and local levels. Now, she starts her career by opening a storefront newspaper shop, and this is over on Albany Avenue in Hartford, and at that point that was the center of the Puerto Rican community. And her store served as a spot where people could meet and discuss the political issues that they faced. And this is in the 1950s. And by the 1960s, across the country, of course, you have the civil rights movement. And so a number of different groups who identify, whether it's by sex or by ethnicity or whatever it might be, they begin to see that as a model for broad change elsewhere, okay? And they look for recognition again of their basic rights and of their humanity. And the Puerto Rican community in Hartford is part of that movement. And it's also becoming, by the late 60s, increasingly tense. In 1969, there's approximately 20,000 Puerto Ricans living in Hartford, and a riot breaks out. A riot breaks out when members of a French-Canadian motorcycle gang. I did not know there were French-Canadian motorcycle gangs, but now I know. And they're called the Comancheros, which I thought was an odd choice. But who am I to judge? They allegedly beat up an older Puerto Rican man in a restaurant. Other sources just call this a bar fight, but regardless of who you ask, this is where it begins. The Comancheros had been sort of prowling around the North End. They were notorious for just throwing bricks through windows just because. And so they're sort of at a breaking point where the Puerto Rican community decides that they've had it, both with that group and for what they stand for. So, for example, the Hartford Current, which is, of course, the paper of record that's been around since before the Revolution, every time there was a crime committed by a Puerto Rican person, they report on that. But every time somebody Puerto Rican did something positive, not in the paper, nowhere to be had. And if you know your sort of civil rights history, this shouldn't surprise you terribly much. This is oftentimes how it is. And that frustrates the community, right? That positive, that negative image gets old really fast. And the blatant tolerance of the gang violence by these French Canadians that also gets old very fast. It pushes people over the edge. And as the riot begins, the cops come out, and who do you think they're arresting? The French Canadians? No, of course not, right? So they're arresting the Puerto Ricans. And of course, the community is very quick to call this out as racist. This goes on for days. Right? This goes on for several days. And after 4 days of rioting, Sánchez, who was serving on the local council, she tries to get a meeting with city officials. And she says, look, we're not going to have a meeting to talk about dealing with the riot, because the riot isn't the problem. It's the manifestation of the problem. The problem has roots, right? The problem is this lack of respect, the problems within our school systems. That's what we need to deal with. And so she gets a sort of a tacit agreement to have this meeting. It takes a while to actually happen. She goes out to a group of 150 very angry young men and convinces them all to go home and get off the streets before things get worse. The meeting happens and very little occurs as a result. And the next day, the cops turn the fire hoses and the dogs on the Puerto Rican rioters. And again, if you know your civil rights movement history, that looks really familiar, right? That is one of the ugliest chapters of the civil rights movement. And here it is again on Hartford streets some years later. What follows gets progressively worse. A number of folks in the community file complaints, and when the police go to look at them, they realize there are stacks of these complaints that nobody has paid any attention to. Investigations that are promised that never happened. The Current publishes a piece, supposedly news, but really opinion, that blames the rioting on the neighborhood itself in clearly racist terms and calls the residents pigs, among other things. Angry reactions to things like this, because that's exactly the kind of thing that they're talking about as being a problem. Things get worse because then in one of the African American neighborhoods in the city, there's a tenement fire that kills a young boy. And when the firefighters had asked if there was anyone still in the building, the people tried to tell them that there were, but they spoke Spanish, and there were no Spanish-speaking firefighters, so this kid dies as a result of a language barrier. There's a whole series of events in the black neighborhoods as well. And so the city's facing a much bigger kind of problem at this point. It's not a local riot, it's a much broader sense of ignorance of the rights and the needs of different populations in the city. After several days of escalating violence, after this governor, Cello, said that the rioters don't reflect their communities, and she's totally missing the point. That it's not about the violence, it's about the community being ignored at large. At any rate, Sánchez steps up, and she calls out for further meetings, and meetings do indeed begin to happen where the wheels begin to move. And there's another guy within the government who says something to the effect of, what you're actually seeing here is the fruits of a government that fosters this tension, taking responsibility upon the Connecticut government itself. They noted and discussed that many what they call ghetto dwellers had for their neighborhoods. And it wasn't that they didn't want to leave, it's that they could not leave because of the systemic problems within the state. And those spoke broadly to other problems. And the schools were a big part of this. A number of kids come into the Hartford school system in the late 60s and early 70s who only speak Spanish. And the teachers just yell at them in English, which is not a great way to learn a language, right? It's not a good way to learn anything. And so Maria Sánchez gets involved with that. She petitions to get bilingual education, and it becomes mandatory in the state thanks to her. So that kids who come in speaking Spanish as their mother tongue aren't automatically put at a disadvantage. It's just a different language. It's not some kind of personality flaw. And she makes that perfectly clear at a state level. She also works to be on the Board of Ed. She serves on the Board of Ed in the 1970s. This raises the profile of the concerns of Hispanic people in Connecticut significantly, because prior to that, it was a board of white people who didn't care. Okay? And so that changes things dramatically. And by the late 80s, she is indeed a member of the General Assembly, but she tragically passes away a year after she takes office. So again, these are just snapshots, right? They're little pictures of little moments in our shared Connecticut history. So what are we supposed to do with this information? Just sort of, well, that's interesting. and then we go home, and there's something to that, I suppose. I like to think of it as both informational. I like to think of it as giving us tools for coping with the tensions that we have in our state today. Right? You don't have to look terribly hard for that. Was it East Haven 6 months ago? It was just in the paper the other day again, I think because their case was finally heard or something. A bunch of police officers that were in trouble for saying terribly racist things and racial profiling, and then their mayor came out and said something terrible. I can't remember what it was. Like something about taco eater, something ridiculously ignorant, right? So that kind of stuff still on, not a national level, not a state level necessarily, but local enough and in positions of power, and that should be distributed to all of us. I think this sort of information is also a corrective to our sort of wishful thinking about where we live. It's nice to think of Connecticut as part of that sort of bastion of freedom in the 19th century. And it was and it wasn't. Right? Yeah, there are abolitionists who lived here, but there are also slave owners in the late 1840s. That bothers me. And so I think these things are really, they're interesting pieces of information for understanding the world that we live in. And I appreciate that you all came here today. And I hope I gave you some food for thought, something to mull over and see where you take it. That's all I've got to say.
Questions?
I don't remember if you gave the date for that Puerto Rican uprising in Hartford. When was that? Was that in the late 60s or the early 70s? Do you remember the date?
It's 1969.
69, okay.
Yeah, I think it was August.
August the 69.
I think so. Okay. The month could be wrong, but the year is right.
There were people who served on the board with Gloria Sanchez, white people, who were very concerned about the situation she was.
Yep.
The board may not have provided the leadership, but she was not alone.
Right. And that's important because that's how you get things to change. Right? You need coalitions of people to get things to change. But she provides that leadership and that connection to a community that the white folks on the board could not have had.
I was the director of the Manifest Museum in Hartford, very briefly, and that's where horses skeleton.
Yeah.
And I remember being told that part of my collection was that's what you call it, that was there.
Yeah.
And I was assured that they were trying to get funding to be able to bury this problem. Obviously, it was quite a lot.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that they're the ones who ever ended up paying for it. It was Maxine Waters, who's in the state government, was instrumental in moving it along. And I think the church just stepped up and said, fine, we've got space. Let's just do this. But yeah, it's one of those sort of shameful things that I think, if I were the museum, I'd feel really squirmy about knowing what to, because the minute you say we have this box, let's bury it, that brings up all these questions of why you have that box. It points to, how things change over time.
It seems like the Pequots, Mohicans have done well by themselves
Mhm.
in terms of, doing better for their people. You see more things in the government moving in that direction. I mean, we have people all over the country who are in terrible circumstances because of treaties and things we did. Is there any more movement in the government to change that you see?
I don't know that I can really speak to that with any sense of confidence, because my head is indeed mostly in the past than it is in the present. But absolutely, you're right, that, centuries of terrible, deliberately terrible treaties, put people on reservations, and the conditions of those places are oftentimes god awful. I wish I had better information for you, but I don't have an answer.
Yeah, I'm going to say it's interesting. You're talking about the sort of split personality of Connecticut in the years before the Civil War regarding slavery.
Yeah.
Farmington was the Grand Central Station of the Underground Railroad in Connecticut. All the roads led to Farmington.
Mm-hmm.
And I know this because Linda's middle school history teacher wrote a book about the Underground Railroad in Connecticut. And the chapter on Farmington was titled The Underground Railroad. And if you drive down Route 1 in Farmington, the nation's first sort of urban or first suburban historic district, You look on the right, there's 4 or 5 houses there where people actually harbored runaway
right?
slaves. Yeah.
See, because Connecticut's my adopted state, and I've only been here for a few years, all things considered. And I'm from Massachusetts, where that sort of stuff is well pronounced.
The other thing is the Amistad, the Africans on the slave ship Amistad.
Right.
They lived in Farmington for about 9 months.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah,
That's interesting.
They were moved out of New
That far.
Haven because they were moved out of New Haven because their supporters thought that they were too much in the public spotlight there, and they got into a nice out-of-the-way country place like Farmington.
And it must have been a really striking thing if you are one of these slaveholders remaining. I don't know how you would think about your position in society when you're surrounded by the presence of both that major trial and the Underground Railroad. It must have been a really weird space to be in.
Well, concerning the conflict that Connecticut had with having freed slaves and slaves, were any of the slave owners persecuted by like other people that lived in Connecticut that thought that it was stupid for them to have slaves?
I would love to have that information. My studies are much later. And so I teach this period, but it's very quick because it's on a national level. So I didn't really start delving into the details of this until Kirsten asked me to come in, and I started thinking about how I was going to structure this. Because my knowledge of Connecticut history is growing, but it's not substantive. It tends to be mostly colonial, and then a little bit 19th, 20th century, but that whole middle, it's sort of like a space. I imagine that they probably did, because abolitionists were oftentimes a vocal and ornery group of people. I think it's a diplomatic way of putting it. They could get really in your face, is a nicer way of putting it. And sometimes they end up being quieter because the other folks who don't like them are even more in your face. But abolitionists as a whole could be a pretty determined bunch of folks. So it would not shock me at all if there are stories like that, of whether it's petitions or picketing or any of those kinds of things. It wouldn't surprise me. At the same time, it would also not surprise me if their main focus by that point, by the 1840s, is on the South. Right? Because if there are only, I think in 1840 there are 54 slaves, and in 1840 there are 17. So this is a number of elderly people who are dying. They may not be that significantly on the abolitionist radar. And what their big argument is by that point is the expansion of slavery out of the South and into other territories. They're very anxious about that. So I could see it both ways, but we'd have to do the digging to find out which one it is. You know?
Yeah. UNCAS.
Yes.
Is he known now? I never heard UNCAS before, but it's kind of cool. Is UNCAS known as like a national hero concerning the monument, or is it still known as kind of a sellout to his own people?
I think he's viewed as a hero in most corners. And what I thought was really interesting when I was putting this together is that I went to sort of the, how do you want to call it, the tribe's main web pages, and there he's an absolute hero, right? And there are all kinds of parts of the story that I found.
Oh, for his tribe, his personal
yeah, for
tribe.
the Mohegans, yep.
They didn't consider him like, dang, you're selling out the rest of it.
No, because he is responsible for their survival.
Were they like not like we're all Indian, but they just really separated themselves from the rest of the?
Well, the way I think that's useful for sort of conceptualizing this is that Native Americans didn't see themselves as all one people.
So
right?
it's completely separate.
It's completely separate. So in the same way that, you know, the white English settlers tend to be like there's us and there's them, some Native American people, they fought amongst themselves all the time. We have this stereotype that they're this sort of earth-loving, peaceful, you know, folks. And that is, it's way more simple than the reality. The reality is that there are different New England tribes that have fought each other off and on for centuries, and who would then go on to fight against New York tribes. Or the Iroquois was a warrior tribe out of what we think of upstate New York by and large. You know, so there are these different groups that have long-standing arguments. And so when we get to King Philip's War in the 1670s, there is more of a sense that if we don't all bond together, we're going to have a problem. And so you have a whole bunch of different tribes that are taking that on behalf of just like the Native American.
King Philip is.
Yeah, well, his Native American name is Metacom. So, and if you look around town, you'll find Metacom Trail and Metacom this and Metacom that.
Also, King Philip was a Native American. Oh, when you said
Yeah,
that.
and the English call him King Philip.
Oh.
And he's the son of Massasoit, who was the Native American sachem that worked with the Pilgrims, and so there's this whole thing. But at any rate, he brings together a number of different tribes on behalf of just fighting off the English, making sort of a last stand for Native American sovereignty in New England. But he's opposed by the Mohegan, and he's opposed by the Narragansett, until the Narragansett are sort of betrayed by the English, and then they come back. You know, so it's way more complicated than the stereotype lends itself to.
And so, for his child alone, he's considered a hero.
And I think probably for a number of tribes he is. I mean, I don't purport to speak for them, I have no idea, but I think there are good reasons to view him as a hero. You know, and again, if he didn't have any love lost for the Pequot, and the Pequot could be oppressive. So in that context, it's not really any different from a number of other Native American wars. That make sense?
Yeah. For the most part.
It's a lot to think about.
Yeah, it is.
Anyone else?
Thank you again.
Thanks for having me.